My name is Camilla, and I'll never forget the night my mother introduced me to a room full of people as the ugly daughter. It was at a family friend's anniversary party, a gathering packed with neighbors, relatives, and people who had known me since I was a child. The room was buzzing with music, chatter, and clinking glasses, and for a moment I felt invisible, blending into the crowd. But then I heard her voice, sharp and cheerful, drawing attention the way only she could. Before I continue, please subscribe to show Karma you're on the right side. Anyways, she had one arm draped proudly around my older sister, Elena, whose beauty was the kind people never seemed to stop commenting on. "This is my gorgeous one," my mother said, beaming as cameras flashed. Then, with a little laugh that wasn't little at all, she waved her hand at me. "And this is the ugly daughter." The words landed like a slap. A ripple of laughter followed, some polite, some cruel, some too nervous to stay silent. I stood there frozen, my cheeks burning hot, my stomach twisting. My father was standing a few feet away, his glass raised, but he said nothing. Elena tilted her head and gave that perfect smile she always did, as if my mother's words were simply true. Nothing worth correcting. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me whole. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were heavy, nailed to the spot. My hands curled into fists at my sides, nails digging into my palms, the only proof I was still in my body. I could hear the laughter fading into other conversations, but in my head it didn't fade at all. It echoed, over and over. No one came to my defense. Not an aunt, not a cousin, not my father, not even Elena, who could have so easily said, "Don't say that." Instead, I was left to carry the weight of those words alone, pretending they didn't break something inside me. I forced a smile, brittle and false, and prayed no one noticed my shaking hands. That night, I went to the bathroom and stared at my reflection under the harsh light. The face looking back was mine, but I suddenly saw it the way my mother wanted everyone else to see it. Flawed, unwanted, less than. I touched my cheek, my lips, my eyes, searching for what was so wrong. I couldn't find it. But the label stuck. Ugly daughter. It didn't matter how many good grades I had, how kind I tried to be, how hard I worked to make people proud. That one word eclipsed it all. When we got home, my mother acted as if nothing had happened. She kicked off her heels, poured herself a glass of wine, and hummed a tune. My father went straight to bed, silent as ever. Elena scrolled through her phone, already posting pictures of herself from the evening, glowing and adored. And me? I sat in my room with the door shut, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all my life would ever be, defined by laughter at my expense. It was the night I realized something vital. Sometimes the cruelty that shapes you doesn't come from strangers, but from the people meant to love you most. And once spoken, words like that never disappear. They linger, haunting you, until you decide what you'll do with them. From the outside, we look like the kind of family people admired, the Hartleys with their tidy suburban home, trimmed hedges, and a driveway that always gleamed from weekend washings. We were the family who lined up in matching sweaters for Christmas card photos, smiling with perfect teeth while the photographer reminded us to say cheese. On Sundays, we occupied the same pew at church without fail, my mother's pearls catching the light as she clasped her hands together, my father nodding respectfully at the pastor. Neighbors waved at us like we were a postcard. "What a beautiful family," they'd say. And my parents, especially my mother, soaked in the praise like sunlight. But what no one saw, what the photographs never captured, was the tension in the air once the doors closed. My mother's smile faded the second the camera clicked off, her sharp eyes sweeping over me and Elena, always measuring, always comparing. Elena's hair was glossier, her dress fit better, her laugh more charming. Mine? "Stand straighter," she'd hiss at me. "Don't slouch. You'll never look like her if you keep carrying yourself like that." At church, people would tell my parents how blessed they were to have 2 daughters, and my mother would beam and say, "Yes, Elena takes after me. She's got the grace." Then, with that half smirk she saved for me, she'd add, "And Camilla is different." Different became its own curse, a polite substitute for what she really meant. Lesser. Holiday gatherings were no better. Every Thanksgiving dinner meant Elena was paraded out like a prize, complimented for her beauty, her poise, her easy charm. I was the one who set the table, cleared the dishes, and overheard the aunts and uncles ask my mother, "So what about your younger one? What's she up to?" My mother's voice would dip just slightly when she spoke of me, never with pride, always with resignation. "She does fine, I suppose." The message was clear. I was filler in a story that had already chosen its star. Neighbors adored us, but none of them ever noticed the little cracks that lived inside our walls. They didn't hear the laughter at my expense when I tripped, or the comments disguised as advice. "Maybe you should wear more makeup, Camilla. It might help." They didn't see the way my father stayed silent through it all, as though neutrality excused neglect. They couldn't know how often I lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wishing I could trade places with Elena just for one day, just to know what it felt like to be adored instead of dismissed. The glossy exterior was a performance perfected over years. And like any performance, it demanded silence from those who knew the truth. I was cast as the background character, the one who didn't shine but kept the illusion intact. My family's reputation depended on it. The Hartleys, the perfect family. And maybe, to the outside world, we were. But to me, perfection was just a mask my mother wore, one that grew heavier every time she used it to hide the cruelty that lived underneath. Elena was always the beautiful one. That wasn't just how my mother introduced her at family gatherings, it was how the world seemed to see her, how every room lit up when she walked in. From the moment we were old enough to be compared, Elena was praised like a prize ribbon, while I was treated like the consolation prize no one wanted to claim. At school events, teachers and parents would stop to compliment her hair, her smile, her clothes. "Such a pretty girl," they'd gush, just like her mother. I'd be standing right there, holding my project or nervously smoothing my dress, and the most I'd hear was, "And that's her sister, right?" I wasn't Camilla. I was Elena's sister, an accessory to her shine. It didn't help that my mother reinforced it at every turn. "Elena, you should model. Camilla, maybe try harder at math. Elena, wear that blue dress, it brings out your eyes. Camilla, don't wear stripes, they make you look wider." Even my father, who rarely spoke, made his preferences obvious. When Elena twirled in a new outfit, his face would light up. When I showed him my report card, heavy with A's, he'd nod absently and say, "That's good." I learned early that my successes could never compete with her looks. Every holiday, it was the same story. Elena would glide into the room, perfectly styled, and everyone's attention shifted to her like metal drawn to a magnet. "You're stunning," the aunts would say. "She's going to break hearts," the uncles would joke. And me? My mother's voice would cut in, sharp and flat. "And this is Camilla, the younger one." Laughter would sometimes follow, the kind that stings more than it sounds. It wasn't just the compliments Elena received, but the affection. She was hugged tighter, kissed on the cheek more often, spoiled with small gifts and extra desserts. I noticed how her plate was always fuller at dinner, how her stories were met with attentive smiles while mine were brushed aside. When I tried to speak, someone would interrupt. When I laughed, someone would mimic it. When I looked too long in the mirror, my mother would sigh, "Stop comparing yourself to Elena. You'll never be her." And maybe that was the cruelest part, how the comparisons became constant, inescapable. If Elena was the sun, I was the shadow, existing only because she stood in the light. When she won homecoming queen, I sat in the bleachers while my classmates whispered, "Her sister looks nothing like her." When she posted photos online, the comments flooded in. Gorgeous, flawless, perfection. And the rare times I appeared in the background, the silence about me was deafening. I can't say I hated her for it. Elena didn't ask to be the beautiful one, and sometimes I saw the pressure weigh on her too. But what I hated was how my parents built a pedestal for her and forced me to watch from below, mocking me if I even tried to climb it. Beauty was her crown, and my role was to remind everyone what beauty wasn't. That was the script my mother wrote for us, and everyone else played along. It always started as a joke. At least, that's what they told me when my cheeks burned and I wished the floor would open up and swallow me whole. "Don't be so sensitive, Camilla. We're just teasing." But when the joke always landed on you, when the punchline was always your face, your body, your presence, it stopped feeling like humor and started feeling like a cage. At family barbecues, my uncle would grin and call out, "Here comes the plain one," as I carried the salad bowl to the table. Everyone laughed, even Elena, who sometimes looked guilty but never spoke up. At Christmas, my cousins had a running gag of pretending not to recognize me in the annual photos. "Who's that in the corner? Oh, right, it's the ugly one." Camera flashes would pop as their laughter filled the room. My mother would shake her head in mock dismay. "Don't be cruel," she'd scold, but the smile tugging at her lips betrayed her amusement. Even when I achieved something worth celebrating, the joke was there, waiting. When I won an art competition at school, my aunt patted my hand and said, "Well, she may not be the looker, but at least she's creative." Another time, when I got the lead in a debate tournament, my father chuckled. "Brains over beauty, I guess. Lucky for you." Everyone laughed again, and I laughed too, because not laughing only made it worse. The nicknames followed me like shadows. Duckling, my mother sometimes called me, shaking her head when my hair frizzed or my clothes didn't flatter me. Background, my cousins whispered when Elena took center stage for another recital, another award. Once, during a family reunion, my grandmother even joined in, saying, "At least Elena got your mother's good looks. Camilla looks more like the neighbors." She meant it lightly, but the words lodged deep. I tried to fight back in small ways, changing my hair, buying clothes with money I saved from babysitting, even wearing makeup too young. Each time the comments sharpened. "Trying a little too hard, aren't you?" my brother teased. "Don't bother competing," my mother said. "You'll only embarrass yourself next to Elena." And the laughter would come again, circling me like wolves. The worst part was how normalized it became. I could predict the rhythm of it at every gathering, the greeting, the food, the inevitable remark that reminded everyone of their roles. Elena, the beautiful one. Camilla, the ugly one. Even when extended relatives came around, they seemed to know the script, smiling at Elena, and then glancing at me with pity or silence. It was as if my entire identity had been whittled down to what I wasn't. After a while, I stopped trying. I stopped dressing up for dinners, stopped showing excitement at family events, stopped hoping for a moment when someone might look at me and see more than the joke. I would sit at the table, picking at my food, waiting for the laughter to come, bracing myself for the familiar sting, and every time it did, I told myself I didn't care. But I did. Each laugh carved another mark inside me until I carried them all, the nicknames, the comments, the cruel echoes, as proof of what they thought I was. Not beautiful, not enough. Just the joke. I can still hear the sound of it, their laughter, echoing off the walls, filling the banquet hall, pressing in on me until I couldn't breathe. My mother's voice had sliced through the chatter, clear and sharp as a knife. "This is Elena, my beautiful daughter. And this is Camilla, the ugly one." The pause that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the laughter erupted. Aunts, uncles, even cousins I hadn't seen in years chuckled into their drinks. Someone clapped my father on the back as if it were the cleverest joke of the evening. And my father, the man who could silence a room with one look when he wanted to, sat there stone-faced, silent, letting the moment pass as if it were nothing at all. I stood frozen, the air heavy around me, every pair of eyes landing on my face, my body, my existence as the punchline. I tried to smile, tried to play along like I had so many times before, but something in me cracked. This wasn't a living room joke shared between relatives. This was public. This was my mother in front of a hall full of people, cementing my role in the family story for all to see. Camilla, the ugly one. Not Camilla the artist, not Camilla the determined student, not Camilla who had dreams or skills or worth. Just the ugly one. I excused myself, though no one noticed. My mother was already laughing with a neighbor. Elena was basking in the attention, and the others carried on, wine glasses clinking, stories flowing. I slipped into the restroom and locked myself in a stall, pressing my hand against my chest as if I could physically hold myself together. The tears didn't come right away. First came the heat, a burning shame that crawled up my neck and painted my face red. Then came the trembling, the slow realization that there was no safety net. No one had stopped her. No one had defended me. Not even my father, whose silence spoke louder than any insult. In that stall, with the muffled sound of music and laughter drifting through the door, I understood something I had avoided admitting for years. This wasn't teasing. This wasn't family humor. This was cruelty, deliberate and normalized, and I had been complicit by laughing along, by shrinking smaller, by hoping one day it would stop. It would never stop, not as long as I allowed myself to stay in their world. When I finally looked in the mirror, my reflection startled me. My eyes were rimmed red, my cheeks blotchy. But behind the wreckage, I saw something new, a hard edge, a spark I had never recognized before. It was the part of me that whispered, enough. Enough playing the role they assigned me. Enough waiting for their approval. Enough letting them define me. That night didn't just humiliate me. It changed me. The sound of their laughter would never leave me, but neither would that breaking point. Something in me had shattered, yes, but in the cracks, a different kind of strength began to form. One that didn't care whether my mother, or anyone else in that room, ever saw me as beautiful. One that would, in time, learn to leave their laughter behind. I remember lying awake that night after the banquet, staring at the ceiling in the dark, my mother's words circling in my head like vultures. The ugly one. It didn't matter how many times I tried to tell myself it was just a thoughtless comment, a joke even. The truth was clear. That's how she saw me, how they all saw me. Every gathering, every family photo, every whispered comparison with Elena had been building to that moment. And for the first time in my life, instead of aching for their approval, I felt something else. Resolve. I couldn't change the way my mother spoke about me. I couldn't force my father to defend me, or beg Elena to step aside so I could be seen. But I could choose not to stand there as their target anymore. I could stop letting their cruel words define the way I looked at myself. And so I decided, quietly, firmly, that I was done living in their shadow. The next morning, I didn't confront anyone. There was no screaming match, no slammed doors. Instead, I moved with a calmness that surprised even me. At breakfast, I listened to my parents praise Elena's dress from the night before, her confidence, the way she carried the family name with grace. They didn't mention me once, not even to ask why I had disappeared for half the evening. And that silence, instead of hurting, confirmed everything I already knew. I was invisible to them, except when they needed someone to laugh at. So I began to create space. I stopped volunteering to help at gatherings. I let texts go unanswered. When my mother called to remind me about a cousin's birthday dinner, I told her I had other plans. When Elena posted another series of photos on social media, all staged perfection and gleaming smiles, I no longer felt the sting of being excluded. I simply scrolled past, reminding myself that those images were for show. Behind them lay the same shallow cruelty I had lived with all my life. At first, the distance felt strange, almost hollow. I had spent years craving even scraps of approval, like a starving child chasing crumbs. But slowly, that hunger began to fade. I filled my time with work, with hobbies I had once hidden because they weren't glamorous enough to be praised in my family. I painted, I ran, I cooked meals just for myself, savoring the quiet. Each act, however small, was a declaration. I am more than their shadow. Elena still shone in their world, paraded as the beautiful one. And maybe she always would. But I no longer saw her light as proof of my darkness. I began to understand that stepping away didn't make me weaker. It made me free. One night, weeks later, I stood in front of my mirror again. This time, I didn't see the ugly daughter. I saw a woman who had survived their ridicule, who had chosen distance over despair. My reflection wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished like Elena's photos, but it was mine. And for the first time, that was enough. The first weeks on my own felt like stepping into a storm without an umbrella. My new apartment was barely bigger than a shoebox, with paint peeling from the walls and a heater that clanked louder than it worked. The rent took almost half of my paycheck, and after bills, I had just enough left for rice, pasta, and whatever vegetables were on sale. Dinner most nights was eaten out of mismatched bowls from the thrift store, sitting cross-legged on the floor because I couldn't yet afford a table. But even then, with the hum of the city outside my window and the faint smell of someone else's cooking drifting through the thin walls, the air felt lighter. I was no longer suffocating under their laughter. No one was watching me with critical eyes or muttering under their breath about how much prettier Elena looked. My reflection in the bathroom mirror, lit by a single flickering bulb, wasn't compared to anyone. It was just mine. Work was grueling. I picked up long shifts at a small office during the day and a coffee shop in the evenings to make ends meet. My feet ached, my back hurt, and some nights I stumbled home too tired to even boil water for dinner. But the exhaustion was different. It was mine. Not the tiredness of smiling through another round of jokes at my expense, but the fatigue of building something with my own two hands. The loneliness came in waves. I'd see families out in the city, laughing over dinner, children tugging on parents' sleeves, couples holding hands, and feel the sharp reminder of what I had lost, or maybe never truly had. But instead of letting it drown me, I let it fuel me. If my own blood couldn't be my family, then maybe I could create a circle of my own. At the coffee shop, I started talking to coworkers. A girl named Maya always saved me a muffin at the end of her morning shift, sliding it across the counter with a wink. James, who worked the late shift with me, had a habit of scribbling bad jokes on napkins just to make me laugh. These tiny gestures mattered more than the hollow compliments my mother used to throw at Elena. They were real. On weekends, when I wasn't working, I explored the city. I wandered into used bookstores, losing hours between dusty shelves. I sat in parks with my sketchbook, letting the chatter of strangers and the rustle of leaves fill the quiet places inside me. I began to feel pieces of myself return, pieces I hadn't realized were missing after years of ridicule. It wasn't glamorous. My apartment was still too cold in winter, my meals too plain, my shifts too long. But freedom has a taste, and once you've had it, you don't forget. Every time I locked my own door, every time I paid rent with money I had earned, every time I fell asleep in silence without the echo of their laughter, I knew starting over was the hardest thing I had ever done. But it was also the first thing that truly felt like mine. I didn't realize how much of myself I had lost until I started putting the pieces back together. At first, it was small things, taking walks in the morning before work, letting the crisp air clear my head instead of rushing straight into the grind. I stopped eating only to survive and started cooking meals with care, even if they were simple. A colorful stir-fry here, a hearty soup there. Food became less about filling a hole and more about reminding myself I was worth the effort. I signed up for a gym membership, not because anyone told me I needed to change, but because I wanted to feel strong in my own skin. The first weeks were clumsy, weights that felt too heavy, treadmills that seemed endless. But soon, I noticed how my posture shifted, how my breath came easier, how my reflection in the mirror began to look like someone capable, someone alive. For the first time in years, I wasn't seeing myself through their cruel comparisons. I was seeing myself. At work, I stopped shrinking into the background. When projects came up, I volunteered. When ideas formed in my mind, I spoke them aloud instead of second-guessing. The nervous tremble in my voice began to fade as colleagues started nodding, listening, even praising my insights. My manager noticed too. One day, she pulled me aside and said, "You've really stepped up lately. Keep this up, and I see leadership in your future." It was the kind of recognition I had craved all my life, but this time it didn't come from chasing approval. It came from being authentically me. Friendships grew in unexpected places. Maya from the coffee shop invited me to her birthday dinner. I almost didn't go, old habits whispering that I didn't belong. But I forced myself through the door. That night, sitting at a crowded table with laughter bubbling around me, I realized I wasn't on the outside looking in anymore. These weren't people who tolerated me. They wanted me there. James and I started going to open mic nights, sometimes performing, sometimes just laughing until our sides hurt. Slowly, these friendships filled the hollow spaces family once should have occupied. I also found new passions. Sketching had always been my quiet escape, but now I took it seriously. I enrolled in an evening art class, nervous among the students but determined to learn. My professor encouraged me, and soon I had a small portfolio. The act of creating, lines and colors flowing from my hands, felt like reclaiming the voice I'd been denied for so long. Piece by piece, the cruel words that had haunted me began to lose their power. The echo of being called ugly, of being treated as less, still lingered, but it no longer defined me. I was stronger now, not because they told me I was, but because I had chosen to be. My worth wasn't a mirror for their approval. It was a fire I built myself, and it burned brighter every day. The first time someone at work called me an inspiration, I almost laughed. It felt impossible that they were talking about me. But I wasn't the same person I had been just a year earlier, the one who used to shrink in the corner, who kept her head down and tried not to attract attention, was gone. In her place was someone standing taller, shoulders squared, speaking with a confidence I didn't even realize I had built. The promotion came after months of pushing myself. Late nights, extra effort, not because I wanted to prove anything to my family, but because I finally wanted to prove it to myself. When my manager announced in the Monday meeting that I'd be leading a major campaign, the room erupted in applause. For the first time, the recognition felt real. Not a half-hearted nod compared to someone else, not a reluctant, "good job." It was mine, earned on my own terms. With that promotion came invitations I never expected. Networking dinners, industry panels, even a charity gala where the company wanted me to represent them. I went, nervous at first, but something shifted. I no longer walked into rooms thinking about how I was measured against anyone else. I walked in knowing I belonged. People complimented the way I carried myself, the way I spoke with conviction. They noticed the confidence I had been denied at home, and hearing it from strangers was strangely healing. Outside of work, I found my own style emerging. I stopped dressing to disappear, stopped hiding in oversized clothes that were meant to make me invisible. I discovered the thrill of putting together outfits that made me feel powerful. Tailored blazers, bold colors, statement pieces that reflected the fire I felt inside. The compliments came from unexpected places. A barista telling me she loved my earrings, a stranger on the train smiling and saying, "You look amazing today." Each small word chipped away at the lies I had been fed growing up. I began to notice something else too. When I walked into a room, heads turned, not because I suddenly fit some rigid definition of beauty, but because people could feel the energy I carried. Confidence is magnetic. It shines brighter than any feature, and I had finally tapped into it. The glow-up wasn't just external. It was in the way I laughed louder, spoke clearer, held eye contact without shrinking away. Even social media reflected it. Friends tagged me in photos where I was radiant, beaming in the middle of a group, not hidden in the back. People commented things like, "You're glowing," or "You look so happy." And they were right. Happiness had a way of showing up on your face, even more than makeup ever could. For years, my family made me believe I had nothing to offer, that I would always live in someone else's shadow. But here I was, standing in the light of my own making, and it was brighter, warmer, and more beautiful than I ever thought possible. Every time I opened my phone, there it was, another post from my sister Elena. Perfectly curated shots of family dinners, beach vacations, or weekend brunches, all wrapped in captions about love and togetherness. The pictures glowed with warmth and unity, but every time I looked at them, one thing was painfully clear. I wasn't there. It wasn't as if I'd been cropped out. It was worse than that. I had been erased long before the camera clicked. They acted like I never existed, like their family was whole and complete without me. Elena's captions always drove the knife deeper. "Nothing better than family," she'd write with a string of heart emojis, posting a photo of herself clinking glasses with our parents. Or, "So blessed to be surrounded by love." I would stare at those words, remembering the same family who once laughed at me being called the ugly daughter. The same parents who sat silent while the joke cut me open. The comments from friends and extended relatives were predictable. What a beautiful family. So perfect. Goals. Each one felt like salt in the wound. They believed the illusion because Elena was so skilled at painting it. She knew her angles, her lighting, her perfect outfits, and with me absent, there was no one to disrupt the glossy picture she wanted the world to see. But the truth was so different. I remembered the nights my mother would snap at Grandma for being too slow, or the way my father dismissed me entirely if Elena was in the room. I remembered dinners where my stories were cut off halfway so they could gush over her latest accomplishment. And now here she was, parading a fantasy of unity, while I scrolled alone in my apartment, feeling like a ghost. It would have been easy to block her, to silence the posts, to stop seeing the reminders. But part of me couldn't look away. I needed to see what narrative they were spinning, what story they were telling the world. Because it wasn't just about them ignoring me. It was about them rewriting reality, pretending I had never been part of it at all. Sometimes cousins or family friends would message me privately after seeing the posts. "Hey, I didn't see you in the pictures. Were you busy?" I never knew how to answer. Do I tell them the truth? That my family decided I wasn't worth including? That my presence wasn't missed? Or do I smile through the screen like Elena, pretending everything is fine? Most of the time, I just typed back something vague. Yeah, I had other plans. The lie was easier than exposing the truth. Still, in the quiet moments, staring at those glowing pictures, the ache returned. Not because I wanted to sit at that table again. I had long since realized their approval wasn't worth chasing. But because being erased cuts deeper than rejection. Rejection says you don't belong. Erasure says you were never even there, and somehow that hurt the most. It started with whispers, little fragments of conversation that slipped through the cracks of their carefully polished facade. A cousin mentioned at a barbecue that Elena's husband hadn't been home much lately. An old neighbor let it slip that my parents had quietly sold one of their properties, downsizing under the guise of simplifying. And a co-worker of Elena's, who didn't even know my connection to her, offhandedly joked that the queen of Instagram was having a rough time keeping up appearances. At first, I brushed it all off. After all, I'd lived my whole life being told that Elena was perfect, that my parents had it all together, that their life was the one everyone else should aspire to. It felt strange, even wrong, to imagine that image cracking. But as the whispers grew louder, I began to realize that the perfect world they flaunted online was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Elena's posts kept coming, of course. Smiling selfies with her husband, glamorous dinner parties, holiday shopping sprees. But I started looking closer. The husband's smile never quite reached his eyes. The dinner parties were missing familiar faces, friends who had once been constant now conspicuously absent. And the shopping sprees seemed smaller, less extravagant, though she framed them as minimalist chic. Then came the message from my aunt, casual but loaded. "Your parents are going through some things, Camilla. They don't want anyone to worry, but it's not as perfect as Elena makes it look." She didn't say more, but she didn't have to. I knew exactly what she meant. Money problems. Strain behind closed doors. The illusion I had been excluded from was crumbling, and for the first time, I wasn't on the outside looking in with longing. I was on the outside with clarity. Because while their world was wobbling, mine was steady. I had my work, my friendships, my own apartment that I paid for with no one else's help. I had a life that wasn't flawless, but was mine. And it didn't require filters or curated captions to feel real. I thought about all those years of being told I wasn't enough, of being compared endlessly to Elena, who supposedly had it all. And now here she was, struggling to hold together the pieces of her own illusion. It didn't make me happy. Schadenfreude wasn't my style. But it did make me realize something important. Their cruelty hadn't been truth. Their dismissal hadn't been fact. It was all part of a performance, one that was starting to unravel under its own weight. The cracks showed me something I never expected. I wasn't the weak one for leaving. I wasn't the failure for walking away from their table. They were the fragile ones, the ones so desperate to look perfect that they ignored the rot beneath. And as the whispers grew louder, I found myself standing taller, no longer haunted by the image of their perfect world. because it wasn't perfect at all. It never had been. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those ordinary days where I was buried in emails and half-finished coffee. I didn't recognize the number at first, but when I picked up and heard her voice, I froze. My mother. After months of silence, after years of treating me like the shadow in the corner, she was suddenly speaking to me as if nothing had happened. "Camilla," she said, her tone softer than I remembered. "It's been too long. How are you, sweetheart?" Sweetheart. The word nearly made me laugh. My mother had never called me that, not once in all the years I lived under her roof. My mind instantly searched for the catch, because there had to be one. "I'm fine," I answered cautiously, my voice steady. "What's going on?" There was a pause, the kind that always meant she was weighing her words, rehearsing her lines in her head. "Your father and I have been going through some challenges. Things aren't as simple as they used to be. And Elena, well, she's under a lot of pressure. We could really use some help." There it was, not interest, not concern. A request. I stayed quiet, letting her fumble through her carefully chosen phrases. "We know you're doing well," she added, her voice tinged with forced pride, like she'd suddenly remembered she was supposed to flatter me. "We've seen your pictures, heard about your promotion. You've really blossomed. And we couldn't be prouder." That word, proud, felt like acid on my skin. Where was this pride when I was a little girl showing off my drawings, when I was accepted into university, when I worked double shifts just to stay afloat? Back then, my efforts were invisible, dismissed, overshadowed. But now, when they were unraveling, they could suddenly see me. "What exactly are you asking for?" I said flatly. Her sigh crackled through the phone. "A little financial support, just until we get through this rough patch. You've been fortunate, Camilla, and family should help family." Family. The same family who laughed when I was humiliated, who labeled me the ugly daughter, who erased me from photos and conversations. Now they wanted me to patch up the holes in the illusion they'd worked so hard to maintain. I could feel my chest tighten, anger pressing against my ribs. Part of me, the old Camilla, the one who craved their approval, wanted to give in, to believe this was a chance to finally be seen. But another part, the one that had built herself brick by brick away from their cruelty, stood taller. "I see," I said slowly. "So after years of mocking me, of pretending I didn't exist, you're calling now, because you need me." "Camilla, it's not like that," she began, but I cut her off. "It's exactly like that." The silence on the other end stretched, uncomfortable and heavy. For once, I let it linger. I didn't rush to fill the space. I wanted her to sit in it, to feel the weight of her own words. Because this time, I wasn't the desperate daughter waiting for scraps of love. This time, I held the power. When I hung up the phone, my hands were steady in a way they had never been before. For years, I had trembled under their words, shrunk beneath their laughter, bent myself into shapes just to fit into the corner of their perfect picture. But now, I wasn't the Camilla who sat in silence at the dinner table, enduring their cruel jokes. I wasn't the Camilla who swallowed the name ugly like it was gospel truth. I was the woman who had built her own life from the ground up, without their help, without their validation, without their so-called pride. The next time my mother reached out, this time with my father and Elena hovering in the background of the call, I didn't let her dance around the request. I spoke before she could get comfortable in her performance. "You called me ugly," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "You made me the punchline of every joke, erased me from every picture, ignored me until you needed something. And now you think I'll swoop in and save you? They tried to argue, to soften it, to rewrite history like they always did. Elena piped up, saying, "Camilla, you're exaggerating. Mom didn't mean it like that." My father mumbled about family duty, about how we all need to pull together. My mother, her voice tinged with desperation, said, "We were wrong, but this is bigger than the past." "No," I said, louder now, my words cutting through their excuses. "Nothing is bigger than the past you gave me. You called me ugly, but I built a life more beautiful than you'll ever know." There was silence on the other end. For once, they had nothing to say. And in that silence, I felt something lift off my shoulders. Years of weight, years of being unseen, years of trying to prove myself, it all slid away. I looked around my apartment at the canvases leaning against the wall from the art show I'd been invited to join, at the flowers my friends had left on my counter after celebrating my promotion, at the framed photo of me, Maya, and James laughing so hard we nearly cried. That was my family. Not the people who reduced me to a joke, but the ones who saw me, who valued me, who wanted me without condition. I didn't need their table anymore. I had built my own, and it was full. Full of laughter that healed instead of hurt, full of faces that saw me as more than a comparison, full of the kind of love that doesn't vanish when the cameras turn off. For so long, I thought silence was weakness. I thought my quiet endurance made me powerless. But now I know the truth. Silence can also be a seed. It can grow into strength, into resilience, into power they'll never understand. They erased me with laughter, I whispered to myself, the words steady and sure. But I rose in silence, and that silence became my power. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe and please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.